rather than the textbook, what I aim to have as the object of study is the mathematical artifact on which the awareness animates itself. So it is, in a sense, in an aspect of it, n manifold sphere. Um, so the exploration will involve the n manifold sphere, the awareness involved tree, because the 0 points of the n manifold sphere are n-dimensional at each of the n dimensions, starting from 0, n being 0 or a positive number. This is held by the awareness force, and it's also the awareness force that understands it. So there needs to be a study of the awareness force principle in itself, inside the mathematician. In the present day mode of approaching mathematics, the pattern that exists as of now is as if a few people are mathematicians, or the discoverers of mathematics, and the others have to read and understand the textbooks they formed. Now the question arises, or the question then becomes, what is this mathematics thing that they are discovering? And why stick to mathematics discovered by a few people, and so forth? Now we are not going to get into the philosophy of all that. What I plan to do is take these symbols that must rest on something, and that thing on which these symbols that they label mathematics rest has got to be an artifact on which the awareness moves, and the movement occurs as on this artifact the awareness engages operations that are allowed by the artifact. So the study becomes of what is the symbols of mathematics a symbol of. To do that, one needs to be having a strong force of awareness. By understanding or turning the awareness force on the awareness principle itself, it is possible to amplify the force of the awareness. The approach here is going to be a Zen vagueness. The vagueness principle is important because at this stage, I'm not speaking of things I already know on the surface. Rather, I'm engaging a process of discovery. And I am just vocalizing myself or thinking out loud. So the Zen vagueness is important so as not to settle into a narrow idea. So the great boundless doubt principle, because no narrow idea could be the ultimate truth. Even if we figure out the whole mathematical apparatus, the underlying senses, what the operator set formed the perceptions unveil in the meaning sense, and the plane where this meaning sense arises, all those remain to be understood. So all those aspects are in the discovery process, at least on the surface, as I read through the text. The text, as I earlier said, is only being engaged as a set of symbols. The author of the text is not infallible, and neither is this talk meant to accurately express anything. Think of it as an evening conversation. Now, it is kind of safe to assume that the mathematical text was formed by distilling a view of the awareness animated artifact itself, which is the mathematical artifact. There might be uh, limitations to the view, perhaps even certain inaccuracies, but because the logical framework we assume is present, uh, the assumption leads to the assumption that uh, there is consistency of view. There is the consistency of view means consistency in the fact of uh, the operator engaging of the awareness artifact, the mathematical artifact. So the in short, the generated text is going to be used as a window into the mathematical world, like a window itself. You assume you're seeing a mountain through the window. You cannot say the mountain is the window. So the object of study is the mountain or the moon, the sun, or whatever, or a lake or the ocean being seen through the window and not the window itself. In another sense, what I'm talking about is going to be a series of guesses at um, what world from which the view of mathematics arose. There's a, a legend spoken by Plato of a world projecting shadows. So um, I'm trying to make guesses about that world. I'm trying to speak of views of that world, or it could be guesses. Um, Unlike what I said in the previous lecture, it is not necessarily at the early stages a direct, accurate view into that world. It could hopefully be so in later stages. So this is also a kind of self-talk for the sake of discovery. Self-talk is needed. So I'm just going ahead and using a set of PowerPoint slides for the purpose. Now we're approaching the beginning of the text. It's just going to be one page of this book per lecture. I think the book is around 170 pages if you include the index also. So it might go on to around 170 lectures. I'll try to do a lecture a day or a lecture in 2 days. So this is again not intended to be a mathematical lecture, but just as an informal talk as I ponder what the origins of the notions in a particular mathematical text would be. So here's a quote from Banach, who says mathematics is the most beautiful and most powerful creation of the human spirit. Well, it's not a creation of the human mind as such, for the mathematical artifact exists independent of a particular human mind. One might argue it is of the spirit that is beyond the notion of the mind. It's a self-existent artifact on which the awareness animates itself, um, and its animation is driven by operations available on this artifact itself. When the awareness thus occurs, its experience of itself is as the anima, life, the Greek word for life, living force, and so forth. Here, Banach says, I'm not sure if the same Banach, Stephen Banach, uh, as in Banach spaces. Anyway, uh, Stephen Banach says, mathematics is as old as man. Um, so again, it's just a poetic way of saying it. But mathematics is, in a sense, older than the idea of man, for it ought to have pre-existed uh, before the man sense was formed by the awareness scanning the world code, which is the DNA code. The word man is used in the modern sense of a human being. Amongst the ancients, the word man was used in the sense of the supreme being, God, as well. That's why one might see phrases such as Son of God and Son of Man used in an interchangeable sense. In Sanskrit, it is the same. The word for man is used in the sense or in, or as a word, a noun referring to the supreme being or God. Mathematics as such, the mathematics of this world experience is obviously uh, not as old as God. For this is an artifact on which an individual awareness plays while it evolves out a world code, what appears as the DNA form here. There's the individual DNA, that's the world DNA, that's the DNA of a planet, DNA of a higher order system, and so on. The DNA is an n-dimensional code. The title of the first chapter in this book is Differential Calculus in Banach Spaces. We'll get into this in detail, but I'll just make a few guesses here. That's going to be the modus operandi of discovery here that I'll undertake. So the nature of a Banach space is n-dimensional, n-dimensional in a manifold sense, because I'll get into discussing this afterwards. For a one-dimensional object to move, a two-dimensional space is needed. For a two-dimensional object to move, a three-dimensional space is needed. And for a three-dimensional object to move, for animation of space to be experienced in a three-dimensional reality, there has to be an underlying four-dimensional reality which allows the perception to evolve. So space has to exist as a manifold starting from a dimension which we label 0, 0, 1, and so forth. The ad infinitum issue that arises here will be addressed uh, plausibly in the sense of a quantum space of movement afterwards. That is my perception as of now, or my initial idea on how to resolve the ad infinitum issue. Zero is the point where dimensional scans disappear, but the information of all that has to exist in the zero space as well. For instance, while we are experiencing the three-dimensional reality, we have an awareness of animation of things in the higher dimensional realities as well. But it appears to us as alterations of a three-dimensional movement. For instance, um, a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional movement has a different perception to it, but certain alterations, certain senses are arising from alterations in a higher space. In that way, the alterations and states of alteration that we experience in three-dimensional reality has to do with the aggregate of higher dimensional scans. For instance, the nature of alteration of perception involved with the breath principle. It seems as if there's a cyclic, somewhat slight expanding and slight contracting of space itself uh, that one is experiencing. It has to do with the animation of the awareness principle, uh, driven by its experience of higher order uh, dimensional alterations. And there's an inherent spin that is within the system. It is experienced in experienced when physicists research so-called quote-unquote particles as the spin of particles. So the first section of this chapter is notions about Banach spaces and linear continuous mappings. So what are linear mappings? It might the notion of linearity, I guess, has to do with the plausibility or the possibility of superpositioning of perceptions on the n sphere. Each perception on the n sphere in an aspect has to do with the superpositioning of underlying n or 2n spaces. 2n possibly because each space needs to have its reflection for the awareness to stay centered on the zero. That notion of symmetry is inherently plausibly enforced by the nature of this awareness artifact itself. Therefore, all phenomenon that is studied are studied as patterns of symmetry or as equations of zero, equal to zero idea. The equals to zero idea, the origin of that is what I'm uh, driving at or suggesting. A possible note or a possible sense of from where it might be arising. So the first section of this chapter is notions about Banach spaces and linear continuous mappings. So what are linear mappings? It might the notion of linearity, I guess, has to do with the plausibility or the possibility of superpositioning of perceptions on the n sphere. Each perception on the n sphere in an aspect has to do with the superpositioning of underlying n or 2n spaces. 2n possibly because each space needs to have its reflection for the awareness to stay centered on the zero. That notion of symmetry is inherently plausibly enforced by the nature of this awareness artifact itself. Therefore, all phenomenon that is studied are studied as patterns of symmetry or as equations of zero, equal to zero idea. The equals to zero idea, the origin of that is what I'm uh, driving at or suggesting. A possible note or a possible sense of from where it might be arising. The world experience involves the experience of the n sphere. That is what gets interpreted as the universe phenomenon. So, one aspect of that is the notion of intensity, a notion of intensity that is devoid of a sense of space, devoid of a sense of directionality, or from that which is a whole of intensity, space, and directionality. One could abstract out the notion of intensity. Uh, the assume an infinite directional space, infinite in quotes, because assume a space that is of a very high dimension, like 1 by h, where h is the Planck's constant, somehow of the order of 10 power 34 or something. Now, when that space collapses onto the two manifold perception ought to have the datum associated with that space because it rests on that. If it were not available to the awareness on the two manifold, on the two-dimensional surface, then the awareness wouldn't be holding it and it wouldn't exist. Therefore, the infinite dimensionality could be as states of rotation on the um, two-dimensional plane, which in math could get abstracted to the form of the Argand plane, the complex plane. So the mm, so forms such as e power I and a function of the Planck's constant appear in quantum mechanics for that reason. An infinite dimensional, so a very high order dimensional scan is first generated in the generation of the manifold apparently, and then that becomes available as directions. In every space, all of these directions are available, but abstracted in a but transformed in a transformed by virtue of topological collapse across these zeros in a different way. So uh, these manifolds, these different manifolds, physics suggests, and it would seem based on direct perception, is associated with the notion of color. The color is the color of a plane is the dimensionality of folding of spin associated with the perception. An apparent linear scan, as in 1, 2, 3, 4, enumerable scan, has to have some kind of an association with the initial axial dimensional space generation scan. Therefore, when a vector is projected, it ultimately has to have a particular kind of association with this um, central axis initially generated axis that I was speaking of, and then it has to, because there is cycling on that infinite axis, that linear scan has to get associated with a 0 to pi spherical transformation or circular transformation. So intensity is a number associated with um, this factor, that innumerable scan. And because intensity has not just the sense of intensity alone, but it has a sense of directionality. When in two space, it becomes dark and bright. When in three space, it has definitely, when in one space, it has, of course, the bright and this aspect, uh, dark and bright. When in two space, it has its different transformation. The idea generated in one space of dark and bright remains as an inherent property that reflects in the axial transformation as well. So um, across these axially situated dimensions, accessible, which makes the dimensions accessible across zero by the swastika operator. Um, what happens is there is a positive plus a brightness perception, and the next higher dimension there is the negative perception, because this axial scan gets mapped to the plus minus fluctuation in one space. Two space has to have two such axes, uh, and possibly the two surfaces generated uh, through the product formation of these boundary spaces have this plus minus alteration phenomenon. Again, back to the notion of what an intense a field is. A field is something like a complex field. It is an intensity perception, and it has an inherent sense of directionality without going outward into space. Just as the directionality sense on the one axis has a non-directionality interpretation as bright and dark. In the same sense, what happens is um, on an n0, the intensity has two n senses, two n possible senses. Like on the Argand plane generated by two axes on the two surface, there are two, or you could say four, two times two different senses. So along with that, the integral transformations generating the notion of number forms the notion of a field. Now, the numbers that exist are just integral numbers, and across the reflection of the zero, one could mark them with the negative sign, but that, again, on that side, they're just positive, negative, positive integral numbers. Like you could put all those things as positive numbers and put a bracket around them, and by the negative sign signify it exists in a space that reflects the other side. The complex space and the notion of I signifies a spin unit. It does not signify the square root of anything. If it were the square root of a perception in space, then it would be that the roots of plus one and the roots of minus one are symmetrically situated in that space, which is not the case. Are not symmetrically, are virtually at the same points situated, because there is nothing to distinguish the perception of plus one from minus one, other than the notion of left and right. If things were so drastically different about the point plus one and minus one, physics would be so drastically different on the plus one point and minus one point. In the world of awareness perception. So an intensity perception is a field element. An intensity perception having a directional quality, the direction itself, it in its operations form an n hypercomplex field. A vector is different from an intensity element in that it is projected in a direction and it has an axial field element, and that um, structure is in a sense a world in itself, different from the present day notion of a vector. Vectors are recursive because it has to exist in the manifold. You could think of Earth as a vector, and it has an axial intensity perception, a vector projected from a higher order system, the Sun. Vector is a set of vectors. A vector is a set of vectors in the sense of being superpositioned on the same zero, and each of those vectors being mm, vectors unfold in a similar sense. Vectors multiply in a different sense, multiply in the sense have an operation of have a binding operation that is different from uh, the binding operation with similar properties in an intensity space, in a field space, in that a vector, assume a vector multiplication, two vectors multiplying in the cross product sense has to generate a higher space for the product to exist in a general sense. And the available intensities alter in the dot product sense. The intensities are available at the origin space, the root space, or the zero ground space of the vector, the vectors.